The sun hadn't fully cleared the ridge when Gideon Rawls rode back into Ridgeline for the first time in 12 years. He came in from the east, the way a man comes when he isn't sure of his welcome, slow eyes forward, hands visible. The town looked the same the way old scars look the same. The shape was familiar, but everything underneath had shifted. New paint on the general store. A second saloon where the livery used to be. The church still stood at the end of the main street, white and certain, like it had never once doubted itself. Nobody waved. A few men on the boardwalk turned to look. One of them said something to the other without moving his lips much. A woman pulling her daughter by the hand crossed to the other side of the street before Gideon had even reached the middle of town. Not rushed, just deliberate. The kind of deliberate that takes practice. Gideon didn't slow his horse. He didn't speed up either. He rode the way he had learned to move through hostile territory during the war, steady, unhurried, giving nothing away. He had not come back because he wanted to. His younger brother Caleb had died 6 weeks prior. Fever, the letter said. Quick at the end. Gideon had read the letter 3 times sitting outside a feed store in Cheyenne. And each time, the words rearranged themselves into something he didn't want to understand. Caleb had been the one who stayed, the one who kept the small farm their father had broken his back over, who wrote letters every few months with news about weather and cattle prices and the slow, ordinary progress of a life being lived without drama. Caleb had been the proof that someone from their family could do it right. Now Caleb was gone, and what remained was the land. Gideon had no great attachment to the land itself. 40 acres of dry grass and 1 reliable well didn't stir much sentiment in a man who had slept in ditches and watched whole fields burn. But it was the last thing that connected him to anything that had come before the war, before the 12 years of drifting that followed it. You don't abandon the last thing, not if you can still walk toward it. He took a room at the boarding house on the north end of town. The woman who ran it, a narrow-faced widow named Mrs. Holt, accepted his coin without warmth and showed him to a room that smelled of cedar and something older underneath. She didn't ask his name. He didn't offer it. But he saw her eyes move over his face when she thought he wasn't looking. And he saw the moment she recognized him. She said nothing. She closed the door quietly, and her footsteps moved away fast. That was the nature of it. Ridgeline remembered Gideon Rawls the way a man remembers a tooth he had pulled, not with fondness, but with a very specific and unpleasant clarity. 14 years ago, before the war had taken everything in a different direction, Gideon had stood up in a territorial hearing and told the truth about what he had witnessed. The truth involved a man named Percival Stroud, who owned the largest cattle operation within 2 days' ride, and who sat on the board of 3 separate civic institutions. What Gideon had witnessed was Stroud ordering the burning of a smaller rancher's homestead with the family still inside. 2 children had died. Gideon had been the only person willing to say so under oath. Stroud had been removed from his civic positions. He had not gone to prison men of his standing rarely did in those years, but his reputation had cracked along a fault line that never fully healed. He died 4 years later, some said of drink, some said of pride. Either way, what mattered to Ridgeline was not that Gideon had been right. What mattered was that he had said so out loud in public, in front of people who had built their comfort on the assumption that certain things would stay quiet. You don't forgive a man for that. Not in a town like this. Not in 1878. Gideon had known this before he came back. He had made peace with it, or something close enough to peace that it didn't keep him up at night. He wasn't here to be liked. He was here to settle the matter of Caleb's land and then decide what came next. On the second morning, he rode out to the property. What he found stopped him at the fence line. The land had been worked. Not by Caleb, by someone else. New fence posts, freshly cut, running a line that did not match the boundary markers Gideon remembered. The well had been enclosed within a small structure that bore no resemblance to anything Caleb had built. There was a brand burned into the gatepost that Gideon did not recognize at first glance. He sat his horse and looked at it for a long time. Then he recognized it. The Vane brand. A V with a single horizontal bar through the middle like something being crossed out. He rode back to town and went to the land records office. A small room attached to the back of the post office run by a thin young clerk who looked at Gideon the way young men look at old soldiers, with a mixture of curiosity and something approaching unease. The records showed a transaction dated 11 days after Caleb's death. The land had been transferred to a man named Aldis Vane for a sum that was roughly a third of its actual value. The signature on the transfer document was Caleb's, or something that resembled Caleb's. Gideon looked at that signature for a long time, too. Caleb had been a careful man, careful with money, careful with words, careful with his name on paper. The signature in the record book was hurried, slanted, the kind of signature a man makes when he is being rushed or frightened, or when the pen is being held by someone else entirely. Gideon folded that information away inside himself in the same place he kept other things he wasn't ready to use yet. He asked the clerk about Aldis Vane. The clerk's eyes went to the window first. Old habit of a man who has learned that certain names require a quick visual check of who might be listening. Then, carefully, he told Gideon what most people in Ridgeline already knew. Aldis Vane had come to the territory 8 years ago from somewhere east of the Missouri. He had started with a small operation and expanded it through a combination of business acumen and methods that people preferred not to examine too closely. He had a younger brother, Edmund, who had married a girl from the south end of the county about 3 years back. The Vane family's reach now extended into land livestock, a partial interest in the new freight operation, and less officially into the confidence of several men whose cooperation made things run smoothly in Ridgeline. Gideon thanked the clerk and left. He stood outside in the morning heat and let the full weight of it settle. He had come back for a piece of land and had found instead a name connected to everything he had left behind when he rode out of Ridgeline the first time. Not the same man, not the same crime, but the same shape of thing power arranged so that it pointed in one direction, and the people beneath it learned not to look up. He told himself it wasn't his business. The land matter was something he could pursue through proper channels slowly with paperwork and patience. He didn't need to go looking for more trouble than he had already found. He was 58 years old. His left knee ached in cold weather. His hearing in his right ear had been off since a cannon had gone off too close during the 3rd year of the war. He had done his share of standing in the way of things. A man earned the right eventually to let other men handle it. He told himself all of this, and he almost believed it. He rode back out toward the property the next morning, not entirely sure why taking a longer route that curved around the eastern edge of the dry flatland, where the soil turned pale and cracked. He was thinking about the signature, about the 11 days between Caleb's death and the transaction, about what kind of man moves that fast on a dead man's land. That was when he saw her. She was on a boulder about 40 yards off the road, both legs hanging over the side. Her body curved forward over her knees in the posture of someone who has stopped moving, not because they chose to, but because moving became impossible. From a distance, with the morning light coming in low and flat, she looked like something the landscape had simply produced a detail of the terrain that had no particular story. Then he saw her feet. No boots, no shoes. The soles caked white with the pale dust of the dry, flat land, which meant she had been walking it for a long time. He looked at the distance she would have had to cover from the nearest farmstead to this point, and did the math quickly. Several miles minimum. In the dark, from the look of it, the kind of distance you cover when daylight itself feels dangerous. He brought his horse off the road and approached at an angle not straight on. He stopped about 20 feet away and stepped down from the saddle without rushing it, keeping his movements visible and unhurried. The horse drifted a step and stopped. Gideon stayed where he was. The young woman looked up. She had dark circles under her eyes that had nothing to do with one bad night. Her hair had come mostly loose and hung across one side of her face. Her dress light colored once now gray with dust and dark in places with something that had dried, was torn across the back in a way that a fall doesn't produce. Falls tear fabric downward. This had gone sideways, like fabric caught on something, while the person wearing it was being pulled in a different direction. Her eyes found him and did what eyes do when they have learned through long practice that strangers represent a category of risk rather than a category of help. They assessed. They calculated. They found no immediate reason to trust. But they also found, apparently, no immediate reason to run. Gideon didn't speak right away. He turned to his saddlebag, drew out a tin cup, and his canteen filled the cup and walked it to a point about halfway between them. He set it on a flat rock and stepped back to where he had been standing. She watched all of this without moving. Then slowly she reached out and took the cup. She drank with both hands wrapped around it, and water ran down her chin, and she didn't notice or didn't care. The way she drank told him things about how long she had been out here, that the dust on her feet had only suggested. Gideon gave her time. Time was one of the things he still had in reasonable supply. After a while, he said, "You don't have to tell me anything." She looked at him over the edge of the cup. "But I'm not going anywhere until I know you've got somewhere to go." He kept his voice low and flat. No particular warmth in it, but no edge either. The voice of a man stating a practical fact. She set the cup down. She was quiet for another long moment. Then, with a movement that was sharp and deliberate, and somehow both defiant and exhausted, at the same time she turned sideways and pulled the torn fabric of her dress away from her back and side. Gideon looked. He had seen damage before. The war had given him a comprehensive education in what human tissue looks like when it has been subjected to force, and his mind categorized what he was seeing before the rest of him had fully caught up. The bruising ran from her ribs down across her hip in layers old yellow-green beneath newer purple-black on top, the accumulated record of events that had happened on different days. The pattern was not random. It was not the scattered asymmetry of accidental injury. It was concentrated, deliberate, the result of someone who had taken their time. He didn't let anything show on his face, not because he didn't feel it. The thing that moved through him in that moment was cold and heavy and settled into his chest like iron, but because what she needed from him right now was not his reaction. She needed to see what he did next. She was watching him, still watching him, testing him the way someone tests old ice, pressing down carefully to see where it gives. "See for yourself," she said. Her voice was quieter than he expected, steady in a way that cost her something to maintain. She wasn't asking for pity. She was presenting evidence. She had done this before, presented this evidence to other people, and those other people had found reasons to look away. Gideon said, "I see it." He reached into his coat, drew it off slowly, and set it on the rock beside her. Not draped over her shoulders, set down so she could take it or leave it on her own terms. She pulled it around herself. "Who did this?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Her lips moved first silently, as if she were practicing the name before speaking it, as if saying it out loud was an act that required its own kind of preparation. "Aldis Vane," she said. The morning heat pressed down on the dry, flat land. Somewhere behind them, a fence post shifted in the wind with a low, slow groan. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "You his kin?" he asked. "His brother's wife?" She said it the way people say things that used to mean something different. "My name is May Dunbar." Gideon nodded slowly. He didn't say his name yet. Names in a situation like this were something to offer gradually, the way you offer water, in measured amounts, letting the other person decide how much they want. "The bruises on your back," he said. "Those aren't all from the same day." She shook her head. "How long?" She looked at the flat land for a moment. "Long enough that I stopped counting." Then she added without being asked, "My husband knows, Edmund. He's known for a while." He tried to stop it. A pause. Not the pause of someone thinking, the pause of someone who has already thought about this more times than they can count. He tried once, early on. Aldis reminded him of certain things, money things. After that, Edmund stayed quiet. Gideon understood the structure of it. He had seen it in different forms, a man made small by debt or fear or both, and the smallness spreading until it covered everything, including the things he should have protected. The cruelty wasn't only Aldis Vane's, but it wasn't only Edmund's either. It was the kind that grows in the space between what a man does and what he tells himself about what he does.
"Where were you headed?"
Gideon asked. "Away," she said simply. "Then there's a woman, Sicily Puit. Her farm is east of here. She's helped before. Small ways." May paused. "I didn't know if she'd take me in, but it was the only direction I had." Gideon knew the Puit farm. Sicily Puit had been a fixture of the eastern edge of the county for as long as he could remember, a woman who had outlasted her husband and 2 difficult winters and a legal dispute over water rights, and had come out the other side of all of it with a particular brand of quiet authority that people tended to respect without fully understanding why. She and Gideon had a history of the uncomplicated kind. He had once helped her settle a boundary disagreement with a neighbor who had been relying on her isolation to take advantage of her. She had thanked him with a meal and a straightforward handshake, and that had been the end of it. Trust without sentimentality.
"I know where her farm is,"
Gideon said. "Can you ride?" May looked at his horse with the measured assessment of someone making an honest evaluation of her own condition. "If I have to." "You have to," he said. They rode to Sicily Puit's farm in a silence that was not uncomfortable so much as careful, the silence of 2 people who are each waiting to see what the other turns out to be. Cecily came out of the barn when she heard the horse. She was a woman of around 55, solid through the shoulders, with gray streaking through dark hair, pulled back, without particular attention to arrangement. Her eyes went over the situation in the direct, comprehensive way of someone who has learned that the full picture is always more useful than the comfortable portion of it. She looked at May first, then at Gideon, then back at May with an expression that settled into something past surprise and was simply there, present, practical. "Inside," she said. She said it the way people say things when words are insufficient to the situation and the only real response is action. Gideon stayed near the door of the barn. He heard low voices from inside Cecily's steady murmur, and May's responses shorter and less steady. Then a silence. Then one sound, brief and muffled, that stopped itself quickly. the kind of sound that comes from someone who has been holding something for a very long time and has briefly, involuntarily let a small part of it out. Then quiet again. Cecily came back outside after a time, drying her hands on her apron. "It's bad," she said, her voice flat with the specific flatness of a person describing something that makes them angry, but they've chosen to channel the anger into usefulness rather than noise. Gideon said nothing. He knew the shape of what she meant. Not the first time. Cecily looked at the line of hills to the east. Not close to the first time. "Aldis Vane," Gideon said. Cecily looked at him. "You know the family?" "I know the name." He paused. "More now than I did yesterday." Cecily studied him with the kind of attention that takes the measure of a man, not by what he says, but by what he holds back. Whatever she found appeared to satisfy her. "She needs to get to Creswell," she said. Sheriff Creswell ran the law in Ridgeline with the somewhat underfunded and somewhat undermanned efficiency of a man doing the job as honestly as his circumstances allowed. "She needs to tell him what she told me, in detail. Vane will fight it. Vane always fights it. Doesn't mean she doesn't say it." Cicely's voice carried no particular anger in that moment. Just the plain insistence of someone who knows that silence is the mechanism by which the thing continues. Gideon leaned against the fence post and looked at the road that led eventually back to Ridgeline, the road that Aldis Vane would eventually come down. Inside the barn, May sat with the coat still around her shoulders, listening to everything through the thin wood wall, with the careful attention of someone who has learned to gather information about her situation from whatever sources were available. She heard Cecily's voice. She heard the man's voice, low, unhurried, with a quality she had not often encountered in men, which was the quality of saying only what was necessary and meaning all of it. She had shown him her back, not because she was certain he would help. She had shown him because she had learned, through the specific education of the last 3 years, that the moment of revelation was a kind of test. And the test was not whether a man was shocked, but whether being shocked gave him a reason to leave. Most men, when confronted with the full evidence of what had been happening inside the walls of the Vane property, found reasons. Reasons of propriety, of practicality, of the general difficulty of inserting oneself into a family matter. The man outside hadn't found a reason. She didn't know yet what that meant about him, but she recognized it as different, and different was at this particular moment the most she could ask for. Gideon straightened from the fence post when he saw the dust. It came from the west, 3 separate columns of it moving in formation. Not fast. That was the part that told you the most. Men riding fast were men reacting. Men riding at a measured pace were men who believed they had already won. 3 riders came into view as they cleared the rise. 2 of them, he didn't know, hired men the kind that every operation of a certain size kept on hand for purposes that the books didn't need to reflect. The man in front, he didn't need to be introduced to. Aldis Vane was tall in the saddle, angular, with the specific kind of stillness that isn't calm, but is the thing calm is sometimes mistaken for. An old scar traced a pale line along one cheekbone. He held his reins loosely, and he looked at Gideon the way a man looks at an unexpected item in a room he thought he had already arranged to his satisfaction. He brought his horse to a stop in the yard. He didn't dismount.
"You're on Puit land,"
Gideon said. Not loud, not aggressive, just a statement of the current geographical situation. Aldis looked at him for a moment.
"I've got family property on this land,"
he said. His voice was even,
controlled in the way that indicates a great deal of practice at control. "My brother's wife has gone missing. We're concerned." "She hasn't gone missing,"
Gideon said.
"She's here. She came here on her own." "Came here on her own."
Aldis said it back as if tasting the phrase.
"In the state she was in when she left woman's not well. Hasn't been well for some months. She needs to come home where she can be looked after properly."
Gideon didn't move from where he was standing.
"Funny kind of looking after," he said. "That leaves marks like the ones I saw."
One of the hired men shifted in his saddle. Aldis didn't look at him, but the shift stopped.
"You don't know what you saw,"
Aldis said.
"and you don't know this family."
"I know the name well enough," Gideon said. "Anybody who's been in this county more than 2 days knows it." Something moved across Aldis Vane's face. Not anger, not yet. The assessment that precedes anger in a man who has learned to calculate before he reacts. He was taking Gideon's measure, looking at the age, the steadiness, the way the older man's hands hung at his sides, looking for the fear that should have been there and finding the absence of it, which was its own kind of information.
"This is a family matter,"
Aldis said.
"Not your concern." "It became my concern,"
Gideon said,
"when she ended up on a rock in the middle of a field without any shoes."
The hired man on the left dismounted. He did it quickly with the ease of someone who has performed this particular action, the prelude to a specific kind of conversation enough times to have made it routine. He had a knife on his hip, and his hand was already moving toward it as his feet hit the ground. Gideon moved, not fast, precise. There was a long-handled shovel leaning against the corner post of the fence, and his hand found it without looking, the way a hand finds something it has already noted and filed. He brought it around in a controlled arc and caught the hired man clean across the wrist. The sound was bone-dense. The knife hit the dirt. The man grabbed his wrist and went down to one knee with a sound that was half curse and half something less composed. The second hired man came from the right, faster and angrier than the first, leading with his shoulder. Gideon turned into it rather than away from it, took the impact across his own shoulder, which sent a sharp, clean pain down his left arm, all the way to his fingers, and used the man's forward momentum to redirect him hard into the water trough. Water sprayed. The horse at the fence line danced sideways and snorted. Gideon stepped back to where he had been standing, His arm was still sending information about its dissatisfaction up through his shoulder. He noted it and set it aside. Aldis Vane had not moved. He sat his horse and watched the two men on the ground with the expression of someone reviewing work that has been done below the expected standard. Then he looked back at Gideon. His hand rested near the grip of his revolver. Not drawn. Resting.
"You're making this bigger than it needs to be,"
he said.
"I'm standing in one place,"
Gideon said.
"I haven't made anything bigger."
Aldis was quiet for a moment. The hired man with the hurt wrist was getting slowly to his feet. The other one was dripping beside the trough.
"We'll settle this properly,"
Aldis said.
"In town, in front of Creswell." "That's exactly where I was planning to take her,"
Gideon said. Something passed through Aldis Vane's eyes at that. Too quick to name, but it was there. He turned his horse without another word, and the two hired men remounted and followed him back toward the road. Gideon watched them go. He watched until the dust settled back down and the road was empty again. Sicily appeared at his shoulder. She had come out of the barn quietly and stood beside him, looking at the same empty road.
"He agreed too easily,"
Gideon said. "Yes," Sicily said. "He did." From inside the barn, May had heard every word of it. She sat in the dimness with the coat still wrapped around her, and she thought about the way Aldis had agreed. The smoothness of it, the absence of the particular kind of anger he displayed when things were not going the way he had planned. She had lived inside the shape of Aldis Vane's plans long enough to recognize the absence of resistance not as defeat, but as the sign of a man who has already moved to his next position. She didn't say this yet. She was still thinking about it when Gideon came back inside, and she looked at him, this older man, with the sore shoulder and the steady eyes, and the quality of saying only what was necessary. And she thought about the question she had been asking without words since the moment she had pulled the fabric away from her back and watched him look at her without looking away. The question was whether he was different, whether the steadiness was real, or whether it was simply a longer version of the same thing she had seen before, a man who appeared solid from a distance and revealed his limitations the moment the cost of standing still became something more than theoretical. She didn't have an answer yet, but the question itself felt for the first time in a long time like something worth asking. The road to Ridgeline was 12 miles of flat open country that offered no shade and no illusions. Gideon rode slightly ahead, May behind him on Sicily's spare horse, a steady brown mare that moved without complaint. Sicily rode on May's left, close enough to be present without crowding. The three of them moved at a pace that was practical rather than urgent, which was its own kind of statement about how Gideon understood the situation. Urgency was for men who hadn't thought things through. Measured movement was for men who had. The morning had burned off into full dry heat, the kind that settled over Wyoming Territory in summer, like a hand pressed flat against the land. The grass on either side of the road was pale and brittle, and it moved in the hot wind without enthusiasm. May rode without speaking for the first several miles. She sat the horse with more ease than her condition suggested she should have, which told Gideon something about who she had been before the last 3 years had worked their changes on her. A woman who had grown up around horses. A woman who had once moved through the world with a different set of assumptions about it. He didn't press her for conversation. He rode and thought, and let the miles do what miles do, which is to clarify slowly the distance between where you started and where you are going. He was thinking about the signature, Caleb's name on a land transfer document 11 days after death, with the slanted, hurried quality of something signed under duress or signed by someone else entirely. He was thinking about the vain brand on the fence post of his brother's property. He was thinking about the way Aldis had agreed to ride to Ridgeline without sufficient argument, the smoothness of it, the absence of resistance from a man who did not accept outcomes he hadn't arranged in advance. And he was thinking about the distance between what he knew and what he could prove. These were 2 very different territories, and the road between them was not always straight. After a while, May spoke. "He'll have a story ready," she said, not a question. "Yes," Gideon said. "He always has a story ready." She was quiet for a moment. "He's been building this one for a long time. The version where I'm unstable, where the things that have happened to me are things I've done to myself." She said it without particular emotion, the way you describe the weather in a place you've been long enough to stop finding it remarkable. He told Edmund that story first, made sure Edmund believed it before he made sure anyone else did. "Edmund believe it?" Gideon asked. May considered this. "Edmund believes what's least dangerous to believe," she said finally. "That's not the same thing." Sicily, riding on May's left, said nothing, but she had been listening to every word with the attentive stillness of someone filing information carefully. Gideon turned this over. A man who believed what was least dangerous to believe was not the same as a man who was convinced. Which meant there was something underneath the belief that hadn't been fully covered over. Whether that something could be reached, and whether reaching it would matter, was a question he didn't yet have enough information to answer.
Aldis came to this territory 8 years ago,
Gideon said.
Not a question either.
7, May said.
Edmund was already here. Aldis followed him. That's the way Aldis does things. He lets Edmund go first, then he comes and arranges everything around Edmund until Edmund can't see past him anymore. Edmund ever push back?
A long pause. Once, early. Before we were married, even Edmund told Aldis to stay out of something. I don't know what. Edmund never told me the details, but I know what Aldis said back because Edmund repeated it to me one night when he'd had too much to drink. She paused again. Aldis told him that everything Edmund had, everything he thought was his, existed because Aldis allowed it to exist. That without Aldis, Edmund would be nothing in this county, would own nothing, would have nothing.
Gideon rode with that for a while, and Edmund decided that was true, he said.
Edmund decided it was easier to decide it was true than to find out if it wasn't. May's voice held something complicated, not hatred, not pity, something that sits between the two in the place where love has worn down to its least comfortable components. I used to think if I could just get Edmund to see clearly enough, long enough, he'd do something. Stand up. Say something. Anything. She shook her head slowly. You can't want clarity for someone more than they want it for themselves. Gideon recognized that sentence, not because he had heard it before, but because he had lived a version of it standing in front of men during the war, who had decided that what was in front of them wasn't what was in front of them. And there was nothing you could do with a man who had made that decision from the inside out. They rode the rest of the way in quiet. Ridgeline came into view as the sun passed its highest point and began the long afternoon descent. The town sat in a shallow depression in the land, its main street running east to west, the buildings on either side throwing shadows that hadn't yet reached their afternoon length. From a distance, it looked composed, self-contained, like a place that had its affairs in order. Gideon knew better. He scanned the approach out of old habit, not with anxiety, just with the practiced attention of a man who had learned that the information available before you arrived somewhere was always more useful than the information you gathered after. And what he saw when he looked at the front of the sheriff's office on the east end of the main street stopped something in his chest for just a moment. A man was sitting on the bench outside the door, hat in his hands, turning it slowly, head down. The posture of a man waiting, but not the waiting of someone who has just arrived. The settled, resigned waiting of someone who has been there long enough to make peace with the fact of being there. Gideon recognized the posture before he recognized the man. He looked back at May. She had already seen him. Her entire body had changed. Not a dramatic movement, not a flinch, but the kind of change that happens when every muscle simultaneously receives a message about threat. She had gone rigid in the saddle, her hands tightening on the reins, her eyes fixed on the figure on the bench, with an expression that was equal parts recognition and the particular cold understanding of someone watching a trap close. Edmund, she said. The word came out flat. Not a question. Not surprise. The sound of a confirmation of something she had suspected since the moment Aldis had agreed too easily to come to town. Gideon stopped his horse. He sat for a moment looking at the scene. Edmund Dunbar on the bench. Sheriff Creswell's office door closed behind him. Aldis Vane and his two hired men, the one with the hurt wrist cradling it against his chest, arriving from the west road and pulling up unhurried in front of the livery at the far end of the street. Aldis didn't look at Gideon when he dismounted. He handed his reins to the livery boy and walked toward the sheriff's office at a measured pace, as if arriving at a location he had already decided the outcome of. He sent Edmund ahead, Sicily said quietly. She said it to herself as much as to either of them.
This morning,
Gideon said.
Before he came to your farm, Edmund was already on his way here before Aldis rode out to collect May.
He worked through the timing as he said it.
He wasn't chasing her. He was already in front of her.
May looked at the bench where her husband sat with his hat in his hands. Edmund hadn't looked up yet. Either he hadn't seen them arrive, or he couldn't bring himself to look at what he had done.
"What's already been said in there," May said, "is the story I have to walk into."
"Yes,"
Gideon said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "He'll say I'm not well, that I've been unstable since the pregnancy, that the marks on my body are—" She stopped. "He'll have a reason for every single thing you saw. A reason that makes sense if you don't know what I know, if you weren't there."
"Then we make it so the truth doesn't need you to have been there,"
Gideon said. May looked at him.
"We build it from what can be proven without your word against his," he said. "Sicily's testimony about your condition when you arrived. The pattern of the injuries a field surgeon or a doctor who knows what deliberate damage looks like versus accidental. What can be documented?" He paused. "And other things."
He didn't say yet what the other things were. There were things he was still arranging in his own mind, still testing for structural integrity, the way you test a bridge before you commit your weight to it. They rode into town. Edmund looked up when he heard the horses. He saw May first. Something crossed his face, guilt and relief in a proportion that was difficult to read from a distance, and both of them complicated by the presence of Gideon and Sicily on either side of her. Edmund was around 30, younger looking than his years suggested he should be, with the kind of face that showed everything whether it intended to or not. He was not a man built for deception, which made the deception he had been engaged in for the last several years all the more costly to whatever was left of him. He stood up. He didn't come toward them. He just stood. May didn't look at him. She looked at the sheriff's office door. Gideon dismounted and helped May down from the horse with a steadiness that asked nothing of her except to let herself be helped for the 8 seconds it required. Then he walked with her toward the door, Sicily falling in on the other side. Sheriff Creswell was a man of about 50, with a broad, plain face and the careful eyes of someone who had spent a long time in the business of listening to conflicting accounts of events and trying to sort out which parts of each account were load-bearing. He was not a corrupt man. Gideon had established this much from what he had observed in the 2 days he'd been back in Ridgeline. There was a quality to the way Creswell conducted himself, a certain unglamorous consistency that told you something real about his character. But he was a man working inside a system with limits. He had one deputy, a young man named Euler, whose loyalties Gideon had not yet mapped with confidence. He had a jurisdiction that covered a large amount of ground with insufficient personnel, and he had apparently spent the last hour or more listening to Edmund Dunbar describe his wife's fragile mental state in terms that had been carefully chosen to make the evidence of Aldis Vane's behavior look like something else entirely. The room was small and close and warm. It smelled of paper and coal oil and the specific staleness of a space where difficult conversations happened regularly. Creswell stood behind his desk. Edmund sat in a chair against the wall hat now resting on his knee instead of turning in his hands. The arrival of May had made the turning stop, which was its own kind of tell. Aldis Vane was not yet in the room.
That was deliberate, Gideon understood. Aldis would let the scene establish itself first, would let Edmund's version settle into the room like sediment before Aldis himself appeared to confirm it. The technique of a man who understood that the first story told in a closed room had the structural advantage of being first. Sheriff Creswell looked at May with the careful, non-committal attention of a man who has been told one thing and is now attempting to take the measure of the person he has been told it about.
"Mrs. Dunbar,"
he said,
"I'm glad you're safe."
"I'm not safe,"
May said.
"That's why I'm here."
Creswell nodded slowly.
"Your husband has been telling me about your condition these past months. I understand you've been going through a difficult—"
"Sheriff?" Gideon kept his voice level.
"Before we go further down that road, I'd like to put something in front of you."
Creswell looked at him. The two men had exchanged perhaps 40 words total in the 2 days since Gideon had been back in Ridgeline. But Creswell was a man who read people quickly out of professional necessity, and what he read in Gideon Rawls was not the profile of a man with frivolous intentions.
"Go ahead,"
Creswell said. Gideon laid out what he had seen plainly and in sequence: the condition of May's feet, the nature and pattern of the injuries on her back and side, not random, not consistent with falls or self-infliction, concentrated and layered in the specific way that indicated repeated deliberate force applied at intervals over an extended period. He spoke the way he had once given field reports, precise, stripped of editorializing, letting the facts carry their own weight. Then Sicily spoke. She described what she had observed when May arrived at her farm. The swollen knee, the split skin, the depth and range of the bruising. She spoke with the particular authority of a woman who has seen enough of the world's damage to describe it without flinching and without inflation. Edmund sat against the wall and looked at the floor. Creswell listened to all of it with his careful eyes moving between Gideon and Sicily and May, and then back to his desk, where he had presumably written down whatever Edmund had told him earlier. He was running the two accounts against each other, looking for where they diverged, looking for what didn't fit. Then the door opened and Aldis Vane came in. He came in the way he did everything: measured, self-possessed, with the specific quality of a man entering a room he believes he already controls. He looked at Gideon briefly, then at Creswell, then at Edmund with an expression of fraternal concern that was practiced enough to be almost convincing.
"Sheriff," he said, "I appreciate your time. This is a family matter that's gotten complicated by some misunderstandings, and I'd like to—"
"Mr. Vane," Creswell said, and something in the sheriff's voice had taken on a slightly different quality, more careful, more deliberate. The addition of Gideon and Cecily's account had done something to the temperature of the room.
"I'd ask you to let me run this meeting."
Aldis inclined his head in a way that was technically deferential, but communicated precisely the opposite. Creswell turned to May.
"Mrs. Dunbar, I want to hear from you directly, in your own words. What happened, and who is responsible?"
May straightened in her chair. Not dramatically, just the small, specific movement of a person deciding to occupy their full height.
She looked at Creswell and not at Edmund and not at Aldis, and she began to speak. She was precise. She was specific. She gave dates where she could remember them, descriptions where she couldn't. She spoke without tears and without theater, which Gideon understood was harder than it looked. The performance of distress was easy. The plain recitation of facts, when the facts themselves were the unbearable part, required a different order of strength entirely. Aldis listened with his hands folded and his face arranged in an expression of patient sorrow. The expression of a man watching someone he cares about say things that aren't true, but that he is too compassionate to contradict harshly. When May finished, Creswell was quiet for a moment. Then Aldis spoke. He was careful. He acknowledged that May had clearly suffered. He expressed with what appeared to be genuine feeling his concern for her welfare. And then gently, but with complete structural precision, he introduced the alternate explanation. May had struggled significantly since the loss of a pregnancy 8 months ago. The marks on her body were real. He didn't deny their existence, but they were the result of incidents that had occurred when May was not herself, that Edmund had witnessed, that several people in the household could attest to. He had documentation. Letters from May herself, written during difficult periods that spoke to her state of mind. He would be happy to provide them. He said all of this calmly, without heat, without the defensiveness of a man who knows he is lying and is trying too hard. Creswell looked at Edmund. Edmund was looking at the floor.
Mr. Dunbar,
Creswell said.
You've heard your wife's account now. Is there anything you want to add to what you told me earlier?
The room was very quiet. Edmund's hands on his hat were completely still. He had stopped moving entirely in the way of a man who has reached the moment where one direction leads somewhere he recognizes and the other direction leads somewhere he does not. And the recognition of the familiar is pulling at him with the specific gravity of long habit. He looked up. He looked at May. May looked back at him. Without accusation, without pleading, with the plain, clear-eyed directness of someone who has already absorbed what this moment is going to be and is simply waiting for it to confirm itself. Edmund looked back down.
I told you what I know, Sheriff,
he said. His voice was rough and unsteady.
I don't have anything to add to it.
Gideon watched May's face in the moment after Edmund spoke. She closed her eyes. She breathed out once slowly through her nose. That was all. No collapse, no sound, no visible fracture. Just that breath, the breath of someone releasing the last remaining possibility that a thing might have gone differently, filing it away with all the other things that had not gone differently, and returning their attention to what was.
When she opened her eyes, they were as clear as they had been before.
Aldis Vane permitted himself one brief, barely perceptible loosening of his shoulders. The loosening of a man who has watched a calculation resolve in his favor. Creswell looked at his desk. He looked at Gideon. He looked at May. He was running the numbers on what he had, and the numbers were telling him something he didn't fully like but couldn't yet see around.
Mr. Rawls,
Creswell said.
I want to be straight with you. What you and Mrs. Puit have described is serious, but what I have in front of me is two conflicting accounts, one of which has a corroborating witness. He glanced at Edmund, and documentation that Mr. Vane says he can produce. I can't act on one account over another without— I understand,
Gideon said. He said it quietly, without argument. Which surprised Creswell. He could tell the sheriff had been preparing for pushback and received instead a man simply acknowledging the reality of the situation.
I have something I'd like to present as well,
Gideon said.
If you'll give me a few minutes.
Creswell looked at him. What kind of something? A different matter, Gideon said. Connected to this one, but a different matter. Aldis Vane's eyes moved to Gideon with a sharpness that had not been there before.
Not alarm. Aldis Vane was not a man who alarmed easily, but a recalibration.
The slight adjustment of a chess player who has seen an unexpected piece move.
Creswell leaned back in his chair. Go ahead.
Gideon reached into the inside pocket of his coat, the coat that May had been wearing and had returned to him when they entered town, folding it carefully and handing it back without ceremony, like returning something borrowed that had served its purpose. He drew out a folded sheet of paper and set it on Creswell's desk.
My brother was Caleb Rawls,
he said.
He died 6 weeks ago. 11 days after his death, his property was transferred to Aldis Vane for a sum considerably below market value.
He tapped the folded paper.
That's the transaction record from the land office. And that—
he set a second smaller folded paper beside the first— is a letter Caleb wrote to me 4 months ago, in which he specifically states that he had refused an offer from Aldis Vane to purchase his land and that he intended to keep refusing. The room was very quiet again. Creswell looked at the 2 pieces of paper on his desk. He looked at Gideon. Then slowly, he looked at Aldis Vane. Aldis had not moved. He was looking at the papers on the desk with the expression of a man encountering something he had not prepared for, which was for a man like Aldis Vane a profoundly unfamiliar experience.
The signature on that transfer document, Gideon said, is worth looking at closely.
Creswell unfolded the transaction record. He looked at it. He picked it up and held it at a slight angle to the light coming through the window. Then he looked at Caleb's letter. He compared the 2 signatures. A long moment passed.
Mr. Vane,
Creswell said. His voice had changed again. The careful quality was still there, but something else had been added underneath it. The particular quality of a man who has just seen the shape of a room change.
I'd like you to explain the circumstances of this transaction.
And there it was. Not the crack Gideon had been working toward. Directly he had built toward it from the side. The way you approach unstable ground, not straight across, but at an angle. He had not argued about May's injuries. He had not tried to outweigh Edmund's corroboration with his own testimony. He had simply introduced a second structural problem.
a problem that existed on its own merits, regardless of what anyone believed about May's mental state. A problem that required Aldis to defend himself on entirely different ground.
The effect on Aldis Vane was not dramatic. He was too controlled for drama. But Gideon watched the man's hands and saw them for the first time move to a different position. The folded, composed arrangement of someone presiding over a situation shifted almost imperceptibly to something closer to the guarded posture of someone who has just found himself managing two problems instead of one.
"That's a separate matter from why we're here,"
Aldis said.
"It might be," Creswell said, "but I'm looking at a signature on a legal document that I'd like explained, and you're the party who benefited from it. So I'd ask you to explain it."
Aldis looked at his hands.
He looked at Edmund, and in that look, brief, sharp, the look of a man checking on the reliability of an instrument he has been depending on, something shifted in the room that had nothing to do with documents or signatures. Edmund saw the look.
Edmund, who had been sitting against the wall in the carefully maintained posture of a man who has committed to a position and is holding it through sheer inertia, saw the look his brother gave him and felt in it the full weight of what it communicated. Not concern, not fraternal solidarity, the assessment of a tool being evaluated for continued usefulness. Edmund looked at May. May was looking at the window. Edmund looked at his hat in his hands. And Gideon, who had been watching Edmund since the moment they walked into the room, saw the thing he had been waiting to see. Not certainty, not courage, but the particular expression of a man who has arrived finally, and without the option of further delay, at the outer edge of what he is willing to carry. He didn't speak yet. The moment wasn't ready, but it was coming. Outside, Deputy Euler moved quietly along the boardwalk toward the sheriff's office, a folded piece of paper in his hand that he had been given by one of Aldis Vane's hired men 20 minutes earlier. He had been told it was a character reference. He hadn't asked what that meant, because Deputy Euler had learned over the 2 years he had held this position that there were questions whose answers were less comfortable than their absence. He reached for the door handle, and Gideon, without turning around, said, "I'd leave that paper outside, Deputy." Euler stopped. The room turned to look at him. Euler looked at the paper in his hand. He looked at Gideon. He looked at Aldis Vane, and in Aldis Vane's expression, he found not the reassurance he was hoping for, but the cool, evaluating look of a man who is currently managing more than he expected, and who does not have resources to spare for the management of a nervous deputy. Euler set the paper on the bench outside and came in without it. Creswell looked at his deputy for a long, measured moment. Then he looked back at Aldis Vane.
"Mr. Vane," he said, "I'm going to need you to stay in Ridgeline for the time being. Both matters, this transaction and Mrs. Dunbar's complaint, require a more thorough examination than we can conclude today." Aldis held Creswell's gaze for a moment. In that moment, Gideon could see the full machinery of the man, the calculation running, the options being assessed, the weight being placed on each possible response. Aldis was not a man who accepted outcomes he hadn't arranged, but he was also not a man who made expensive moves in public when the room's alignment had shifted against him.
Of course, Aldis said.
But his eyes went to Edmund one more time before he said it, and Edmund, still holding his hat, still looking somewhere between the floor and everything else, felt the full pressure of that look and understood that whatever arrangement had existed between them, whatever version of protection and obligation and fear and dependence had kept him in the position he was in, was being called in. Right now, in this room. Aldis was telling him without words that the moment required Edmund to hold the line. Edmund knew that look, had been responding to that look for most of his adult life. He looked at May again. May was still looking at the window. Outside the window, Ridgeline went about its business in the flat. Afternoon light, horses at the rail, a woman with a basket crossing the street. The slow, ordinary movement of a town that didn't know what was being decided in one of its rooms. May watched it and thought about distance. About how far 12 miles was when you were walking it without shoes in the dark. About what it meant to cover that distance and arrive at this room and sit in this chair and speak your truth into air that had already been seeded with a different version of it. She thought about Gideon RS setting a tin cup on a flat rock halfway between them and stepping back. She thought about what it meant that he was still here. Edmund Dunbar opened his mouth. Then he closed it. Then from somewhere beneath the accumulated weight of 8 years of choosing the path of least danger, something that had not been entirely extinguished reached the surface. He looked at his brother, and this time he did not look away first. The silence in that room had weight, not the silence of emptiness, the silence of a room full of people who understood that the next few seconds would determine the shape of everything that followed. The kind of silence that accumulates in small spaces when large things are being decided. Edmund Dunbar looked at his brother and did not look away first. That was new. In 8 years of being Aldis Vane's younger brother, Edmund had never once held that look for more than a moment before his eyes found the floor or the wall or some middle distance that required nothing of him. The looking away had become so habitual that it had stopped feeling like a choice. It simply happened the way breathing happened, the way flinching happened, automatic, pre-conscious, the body enacting a decision the mind had made so long ago it no longer remembered making it. But something had shifted in the last 30 seconds. It had shifted when Aldis looked at him the second time. Not with concern, not with brotherhood, but with the cold, evaluating look of a man assessing whether a piece of equipment was still functional. Edmund had seen that look before, had seen it directed at the hired men at business associates who had become inconvenient at a horse that had gone lame on a difficult day. He had told himself for years that Aldis never looked at him that way. That whatever Aldis was to the rest of the world, to Edmund, he was still a brother. The look said otherwise. The look said what it had always said,
and Edmund had simply finally run out of the particular kind of willingness required to not see it. He opened his mouth. Aldis said quietly and without moving anything except his lips, "Edmund." One word. Just the name. But in the way Aldis said names, there was always an architecture, a structure of implication and reminder, and the specific gravity of everything owed and everything that could be taken away. Edmund had been built inside that architecture for so long that the sound of his own name in his brother's voice was functionally a command. He closed his mouth. May, who had been looking at the window, turned and looked at Edmund now. She didn't speak. She didn't plead. She simply looked at him with the direct, undecorated gaze of someone who has already received the answer and is simply confirming what they knew. And that not Gideon's documents, not Sicily's testimony, not Aldis's command, was what finally broke the thing loose. Because May's face held no accusation, no demand, no last desperate appeal to whatever remained of what they had once been to each other. It held only the plain, tired recognition of a woman who had long ago made peace with the fact that the man in front of her was going to choose wrong, and who had stopped requiring him to be otherwise, and who was simply present in the room as a witness to her own life. That face cost Edmund more than any argument could have. He reached into his coat. Aldis moved, not dramatically, just a shift of weight forward, the beginning of an interruption. "Mr. Vane?" Creswell's voice was quiet and final. "You'll stay where you are." Aldis stayed where he was, but his eyes on Edmund were the full, unshielded version of everything he was. The control and the contempt and the absolute expectation of compliance that had organized Edmund's world since before Edmund had the language to name it. Edmund set a folded piece of paper on Creswell's desk. It was not a grand gesture. His hands were shaking slightly, and he set it down with the careful deliberateness of a man making sure he completes the action before anything in him changes its mind. He didn't look at Aldis when he did it. He looked at the desk. "What is this?" Creswell asked. Edmund's voice, when it came, was rough at the edges, like something that had been stored in a dry place too long. "I've been keeping a record," he said. "Since the second year. I didn't know why I kept it. Told myself it was for protection, in case Aldis ever turned on me the same way." He stopped, started again. "Dates, what I saw, what I heard, what I didn't stop." The last 3 words cost him something audible. "It's all in there." Creswell unfolded the paper. It was not one sheet, it was several, close written, the handwriting of a man who wrote carefully, and had written this more carefully than anything else. The sheriff read in silence for a moment. His face did not change expression, but something in his posture shifted in the way that posture shifts when a significant weight is added to one side of a scale. Gideon watched Aldis Vane,
Aldis was looking at his brother with an expression that had finally shed all its constructed layers. What was underneath was not rage. Rage would have been almost understandable. What was underneath was the cold, clear, absolute incomprehension of a man who has organized the world according to his own will for so long that the world, declining to cooperate, has ceased to seem like a possible outcome. He looked at Edmund the way you look at a wall you have walked through 100 times that has, without explanation, become solid. You have no idea. Aldis said, his voice still controlled, but carrying now an edge that had not been there before, what you've just done. Edmund looked at his brother. Yes, I do, he said. It was the simplest thing. 4 words. But the flatness of them, the absence of apology, of fear, of the habitual deference that had shaped Edmund's speech toward his brother for the better part of a decade, landed in the room with a weight that none of the longer sentences had managed. May looked at Edmund for a long moment. Then she looked at her hands in her lap. She was not going to forgive him today. That was not what today was. Today was simply the day the record was corrected. Forgiveness was a different country with a different road leading to it, and whether she ever made that journey was entirely her own business and no one else's. Creswell set down the papers. He looked at Gideon. He looked at Sicily. He looked at May. Then he looked at Aldis Vane with the expression of a man who has arrived at a conclusion he doesn't particularly enjoy, but has no intention of avoiding. Mr. Vane, he said, I'm placing you under arrest pending investigation into the assault and battery of May Dunbar, and into the circumstances of the land transfer of the Rawls property. Deputy Euler, who had been standing near the door with the careful stillness of a man who had been watching the room reassemble itself around a different center of gravity and was still deciding where he stood in the new arrangement, straightened up. Yes, sir, Euler said. And something in the way he said it, the slight excess of clarity, the deliberateness of a man choosing a side he should have chosen earlier, suggested that the paper he had left on the bench outside was going to stay there. Aldis Vane did not resist. He was not the kind of man who resisted when the mathematics had turned against him in a way that made resistance expensive. He was the kind of man who complied completely, conserved his resources, and began immediately to think about next moves. He allowed Euler to take his arm. He walked toward the door with his back straight and his expression composed. At the door, he stopped, turned, looked at Gideon. You came back for land, Aldis said. You should have stayed gone. Gideon met the look without any particular heat in it. The land was just the reason I came back, he said. Turns out there was other business that needed attending. Aldis held the look for one more moment. Then he went through the door. The room breathed differently after that. Creswell sat down heavily in his chair and looked at his desk for a moment, in the way of a man taking quiet stock of a situation that had required more navigation than he had anticipated when he arrived at work this morning. Then he looked at Edmund, who was sitting against the wall with his hands open and empty in his lap, his hat on the floor beside him, where it had slipped without him noticing.
"Mr. Dunbar,"
Creswell said.
"you'll need to stay in town. I'll have more questions."
Edmund nodded. He didn't speak. He looked like a man who had just put down something very heavy that he had been carrying for a very long time. Not relieved exactly, because the carrying had left its damage, and the putting down didn't undo that, but emptied in a way that was its own strange, uncomfortable form of rest. May stood up. She moved to the door with the careful steadiness of someone whose body has not yet been fully informed that the immediate danger has passed, still carrying the readiness of a creature that has been hunted and has not yet allowed itself to believe the pursuit has stopped. She put her hand on the door frame for just a moment before she went through it. Gideon followed her out. The afternoon light was lower now, the shadows on the main street longer and softer than they had been when they rode in. The air had cooled a degree or two, not comfortable, but less aggressive than the high noon heat had been. May stood on the boardwalk outside the sheriff's office and looked at the street and breathed. She breathed the way people breathe when they are reminding themselves that breathing is still something they get to do. Deliberately, consciously, each breath a small private confirmation. Cicely came out and stood beside her without touching her and without speaking, which was exactly right. Gideon stood a few feet away and gave them both room and looked at the street. There was nothing heroic about the moment, no particular grandeur to it. The street was a street. The buildings were unremarkable. A dog was sleeping in the shade beside the general store. 2 men were talking outside the hardware shop about something that had nothing to do with any of this. The ordinary world had continued operating throughout, indifferent to the specific gravity of what had been happening in the sheriff's office, and now it simply resumed its relationship with the 3 people standing on the boardwalk, as if they had always been there and everything was fine. May said without turning around. "Thank you." She said it to neither of them in particular, or to both of them, or to the general fact of people who had chosen to be present when presence was required. Gideon didn't answer it. It wasn't the kind of thing that needed an answer. It needed to be said, and she had said it, and that was sufficient. They rode back to Cecily's farm as the sun began its final descent. The weeks that followed were not simple. Nothing about what had been set in motion resolved quickly or cleanly, because these things never do. The law moved at the speed of paperwork and witnesses and the patience of men who understood that a case built carefully was a case that held. Creswell was thorough. He was, as Gideon had assessed, an honest man, and honest men, doing their jobs correctly, are often slower than people want them to be, which is part of what makes them honest. Aldis Vane retained a lawyer from Cheyenne who arrived in Ridgeline 3 days after the arrest, and began the work of constructing alternate explanations for every documented fact. This was expected. Men of Aldis Vane's resources and temperament did not accept legal proceedings passively. He challenged the land transfer documentation. He challenged the integrity of Edmund's written record. He produced the letters from May that he had referenced, carefully selected fragments of her own words, taken from their context, arranged to support the picture of a woman in mental decline. None of it changed what the evidence showed.
Edmund's record was specific and dated and corroborated in enough of its details by external facts, dates that matched incidents. Other people had partially witnessed transactions that could be cross-referenced. That dismantling it would have required dismantling a significant portion of verifiable history. Creswell brought in a physician from Laramie who examined May and produced a document describing the nature and pattern of her injuries in clinical language that made Aldis's alternate explanation structurally untenable.
And the land transfer. The land transfer was in the end the clearest thing. Gideon spent 4 days at the land records office with the young clerk who had apparently decided that the arrival of Gideon Rawls in Ridgeline represented a kind of permission to be useful in ways he had previously considered too dangerous. Together, they reconstructed the timeline of the transaction. The 11 days, the signatures' inconsistencies. A second document found in the back of the records that showed an earlier inquiry from Aldis's operation about the Rawls property, an inquiry dated 2 months before Caleb's death. That document changed the shape of things considerably. It suggested that Aldis Vane had not simply moved opportunistically after Caleb died. It suggested that Caleb's death and its timing relative to the transaction was something that warranted examination beyond the simple category of fever. Creswell asked Gideon quietly and privately whether he wanted that avenue pursued. Gideon sat with that question for a long time. He thought about Caleb, about the letters with their news of cattle prices and weather, about the signature that didn't look like Caleb's signature, about the 11 days. Yes, he said. It would take longer. It would complicate things. It would require Gideon to remain in Ridgeline for a period that extended well past anything he had planned when he rode back into town that first morning. He understood all of this when he said yes, and he said it anyway. Some things, once you have seen them clearly, cannot be unseen. And a man who walks past a thing he has seen clearly because pursuing it is inconvenient is not a different kind of man than the men who had been looking the other way in Ridgeline for years. He was just a newer version of the same problem. Gideon was not willing to be that. The investigation into Caleb's death would take time. The case against Aldis for May's injuries moved faster. By the time the first leaves on the cottonwoods along the creek had begun to turn, Aldis Vane was facing charges that his lawyer could complicate but could not make disappear. Deputy Euler was quietly reassigned while Creswell evaluated his conduct. The hired man with the hurt wrist declined to remain in Ridgeline and was not pursued. Edmund Dunbar did not stay. He left Ridgeline about 3 weeks after the day in the sheriff's office on a morning when the light was pale and thin, and the town was not yet fully awake. He left with 1 horse and what he could carry, and no particular destination that anyone knew of. He left a letter for May. Gideon didn't know what was in it. May read it once and then folded it and put it somewhere and never mentioned it. Whatever Edmund had written, she had received it in the private way of someone filing away the last document in a case that was now closed.
She didn't grieve the marriage loudly. She grieved it the way people grieve things that had stopped being what they were supposed to be long before they officially ended. Not with a sudden drop, but with the quiet acknowledgement of a loss that had already been happening for years and had now simply been made official. She stayed at Cicily's farm.
This was not a temporary arrangement that extended itself by default. It was a choice May made deliberately, in the specific, deliberate way of someone who had not been in the habit of making choices for herself, and was now practicing the habit with the careful attention of someone learning a new skill. She chose to stay. She chose to work. She chose gradually and at her own pace to rebuild the practical architecture of a life organized around her own judgment, rather than around the management of someone else's volatility. Cicely gave her room and work, and the particular gift of requiring nothing from her emotionally that she wasn't ready to give. This was rarer than it sounded. Most people, when they help someone through damage, carry a need conscious, or not for the damaged person, to demonstrate progress, to get better, on a visible schedule, to provide the helper with the evidence that the help was worth giving. Cicely had no such need. She had her own history with loss and had learned from it that recovery has its own timeline and cannot be productively rushed.
May learned the farm. She learned which fence posts needed replacing before winter. She learned how Cicely managed the water from the well through the dry months. She learned to assess a horse's soundness the way Cicely did methodically from the ground up, trusting what she could observe rather than what she hoped. Small technical knowledges that accumulated into something larger than their individual parts. A competence. A footing. She stopped looking over her shoulder when she walked through doorways. This happened gradually enough that neither she nor Cicely marked the specific day it stopped. It was simply something that had been present, and then after a while was not. The body releases its vigilance at its own pace when it has gathered enough evidence that the immediate threat has genuinely passed. May's body was slow to release it 3 years of a particular kind of danger, leaves particular kinds of traces, but it released it eventually, degree by degree, the way a fist unclenches, not all at once, but finger by finger.
Gideon remained in Ridgeline. He had not planned to. He had planned, once the matter of May's situation was resolved, to attend to the land question, and then make a decision about the next thing, which had no particular shape yet, and existed mainly as a general intention to continue existing somewhere. He was not a man given to long-range planning. The war had dismantled whatever inclination toward future certainty he had once possessed, and what had grown in its place was a kind of practical present-tense attention deal with what is in front of you, and what comes next will present itself.
What was in front of him was the investigation into Caleb's death. He worked at it steadily, without urgency, the way he had worked at most things in his life, not driven by fire, but by the plain sense that a thing worth doing was worth doing to completion. He spent time at the land office. He rode out to neighboring properties and talked to people who had known Caleb and had, in some cases, noticed things they had not known were relevant until someone came along and asked the right questions. He wrote letters to a man in Cheyenne who knew something about the movement of money through territorial land transactions.
He did not push. He did not perform urgency. He simply continued day after day with the particular persistence of someone who has no deadline and no audience and is doing the work for its own sake. Ridgeline adjusted to his presence. Not warmly, the town's memory was long, and its comfort with Gideon Rawls remained limited. But there is a kind of adjustment that is different from acceptance, where a person is still not entirely welcome, but their continued presence has begun to seem like a fact of the landscape rather than a disruption of it. People stopped crossing the street when they saw him coming. The woman at the general store stopped looking at him with the specific wariness she had shown the first week. Mrs. Holt at the boarding house began leaving a lamp in the window of the front room, which was not a warmth extended to every boarder. None of this was friendship, but it was something. The gradual, unglamorous process of a man and a place reaching a working arrangement. He rode out to Sicily's farm on occasion. Not frequently, enough to remain connected to how things were progressing there and to be available if there were developments in the case that needed to be communicated. He and Cicely had established a pragmatic alliance of the kind that suited them both. Two people who communicated directly asked no more than was reasonable and trusted the other to do the same. May was present during these visits. She was working, usually mending fence or managing the animals or doing the 100 small daily tasks that kept a farm operational. She acknowledged Gideon's arrivals without ceremony and continued what she was doing, which he took as a reasonable sign of normality. A person who stops performing for observers has generally stopped needing to. They spoke occasionally, not at length. She asked once about the investigation into Caleb, and he told her what he knew, and she listened with the attentive seriousness of someone who understood what the question really was. Not just whether a crime had been committed, but whether a man she had never met had been made to disappear by the same machinery that had been operating on her own life for 3 years. He would have been kind, she said after he had told her about Caleb's letters. From how you describe him. He would have, Gideon said. They were quiet for a moment with that. The investigation into Caleb's death did not produce the clean resolution that investigations in stories are supposed to produce. What it produced was a weight of circumstantial evidence sufficient to cast serious doubt on the fever narrative, and a set of financial records that showed Aldis Vane had been prepared for the land acquisition in ways that indicated foreknowledge. Whether that foreknowledge extended to having caused what he foreknew would require a kind of proof that may have existed and may have been destroyed and may never be conclusively established either way. Creswell was honest about this.
It's possible we get to the bottom of it,
he told Gideon.
It's possible we don't. The law works with what it can establish, not with what likely happened.
Gideon understood this. He had known it before he asked the question. He had asked it anyway because Caleb deserved to have someone ask it regardless of the answer. What the investigation did establish clearly and documentably was the pattern of Aldis Vane's operations in the territory, the land acquisitions, the methods, the people who had been on the losing end of dealings with him over 8 years. Creswell sent a full report to the territorial authorities in Cheyenne. The lawyer from Cheyenne, faced with the assembled record, began having different conversations with his client about the realistic range of outcomes. On a morning in early October, with the first real cold of the coming season making itself known in the air, Aldis Vane accepted a negotiated outcome, reduced charges on the assault count, in exchange for a full accounting of the land transactions and the return of several properties, including the Rawls land, to their previous or rightful owners. His lawyer presented this as a practical resolution. Aldis presented nothing because the quality that had allowed him to present things smoothly for years, the assumption that he controlled the room, had been dismantled piece by piece over the preceding weeks, until what was left was simply a man with a set of unpleasant facts to live with. It was not the outcome Gideon had imagined when he thought about justice in the abstract for Caleb. Justice in the abstract is a cleaner thing than justice in practice. But it was real. It was documented. It existed in the record now, and the record was the place where things lived past the people involved in them. Gideon sat on the steps of his brother's farmhouse. His farmhouse now returned through the settlement on the afternoon after the agreement was signed. The land looked the same as it had when he stood at the fence line that second morning and saw the Vane brand on the post. Same pale grass. Same reliable well in its small enclosure. Same flat sky overhead, doing nothing in particular. It looked like his brother's land. That was enough. He rode out to Sicily's farm that evening as the sun was doing the long, slow work of setting over the western hills. The sky had gone the color of an ember orange, deepening to red at the horizon, fading up through pink into the first pale suggestion of night blue above. May was at the fence line on the east side of the property, working a loose board back into place with the focused attention of someone who has learned that maintenance deferred becomes emergency later. She had her sleeves rolled up and her hair pinned back without particular attention to the result, and she did not hear him approach until the horse's footsteps reached her. She looked up, assessed, went back to the board. Gideon dismounted and stood nearby. He didn't offer to help. She didn't need it. After a while, she drove the last nail and tested the board with both hands, a solid business-like assessment, and straightened up and looked at the last light on the hills. "It's done?" she asked. "Near enough," he said. Vane accepted terms. The land settlement goes through Creswell's office. Caleb's property comes back. May nodded. She looked at the hills. "And Caleb?" "We won't get everything we wanted for Caleb," Gideon said. "But we got what the record can carry." She absorbed this without visible reaction. Not because she didn't feel it he had come to understand in the months of occasional conversation, that May felt things at a depth that her surface calm didn't advertise. But she had learned, through long practice, to receive difficult information without letting the receiving of it become a performance. "That's something," she said.
"It's something,"
he agreed. They stood for a while in the evening quiet. The land around them settled into its nighttime version, sounds changing, the light going softer, the heat finally releasing its hold on the air in a way that felt almost like relief. May said, "That first morning when you found me on the rock." Gideon waited.
"I thought I was showing you something that had been destroyed,"
she said. Her voice was quiet and even, and carried the particular quality of words that have been examined many times in private before being spoken out loud.
"Something that was already finished. I showed you because I needed to see what you would do with it. What every person does with it. Look away and find a reason, or just look." She paused.
"I wasn't asking to be saved. I don't think I even believe that was possible anymore." Gideon said nothing. The evening said nothing. The hills held their color for a moment longer, and then gave it up to the coming dark. "Now I think," May said, "I was showing you what was still fighting to survive. I just didn't know that's what it was at the time." Gideon was quiet for a moment.
"You did the surviving,"
he said. "I just declined to be another reason not to." May turned and looked at him. Not with the measuring, assessing look she had given him that first morning on the rock. That look had belonged to a version of her that no longer needed to be the primary way she moved through the world. This was a different look, the plain, direct look of someone who has earned the right to see clearly and is choosing to use it. "That's not a small thing," she said. "No," he agreed. "I don't suppose it is." The last of the sunset faded. The first stars arrived without announcement the way they always do, because the sky does not require permission to continue its operations. They stood beside each other at the fence line as the dark came in, not close enough to suggest anything had been resolved between them, that hadn't not far enough to suggest the distance that no longer existed. Just two people standing on the same ground at the same moment, present and unafraid. May did not reach for his hand. She stood with the self-possession of someone who has recovered through considerable difficulty, the right to decide what she reaches for and when. That right was not available for anyone else to determine, and she was not in the business of surrendering it again to anyone for any reason. Gideon stood beside her without requiring anything of the moment beyond what the moment was, which was enough. More than enough. The thing worth holding on to was not who had ridden in, or what had been said in a sheriff's office, or even the document now sitting in Creswell's files that bore Aldis Vane's name alongside a set of facts he could not rearrange. The thing worth holding on to was simpler and harder and less dramatic than any of that. It was a woman standing at a fence line in the evening of a day that she had made it through, and another day before that, and all the days before that, stretching back through 3 years of surviving something that should not have had to be survived. Standing without looking over her shoulder. Standing with her sleeves rolled up and a nail in her pocket, and the straightness in her spine that nobody had given her, that she had taken back piece by piece. The way you take anything back that someone has tried to take from you permanently.
That was the thing. Not the ending of the bad thing, the continuation of her. And perhaps that is the part worth carrying forward past this fence line and this fading light and these 2 people standing in the ordinary dark. Not the arrival of someone willing to help. Those people exist, and they matter, and they are worth being. But they are not the story. The story is what a person does with the help once it arrives. What they build from the materials of a life that tried seriously and with considerable effort to convince them that building was no longer possible. May Dunbar built. That was the whole of it. That was enough.